There were a couple questions. Actually, one was from yesterday, and we didn't hit this yesterday because I actually answered it, I think, on the first day. If there was only to be life in the temple where God was, then why were there so many animal sacrifices? I made the comment that the sacrifice was conceived of as giving the animal's life back to God. But the carcasses were to be disposed of outside of sanctified areas, and the ashes as well. So it's not there's not an incongruence there with sacrifice and life. You're giving the life back to God. And then there's one just now. What is your definition of the abomination of desolation? Uh, the language in the text about the abomination is quite cryptic and obtuse. I would say that there are a number of possibilities here, and they all fall under the notion of defilement of the sanctuary itself, defilement of the holy place, or some sort of act of sacrilege, and that's about as far as I take it. I don't like to speculate on specifics when I don't really have anything to hang my hat on in that regard. I do think the Antiochus event is worth looking at for its typology, as far as sacrificing a pig on the altar and that sort of thing, and declaring himself to be God. And we don't actually have the specifics repeated anywhere after Daniel. All we have is the phrase that's associated with it. So I'm not willing to say that the same ritual acts will occur, but I am willing to say that there's some sort of act of defilement and blasphemy that occurs there. So that's a quick run through of that. What I want to do now is flip through some prophetic topics and put a divine counsel flavoring on certain things. And also, just to show you that there are some interesting ways that certain issues get approached in the academic literature that you might not be aware of. So we saw this flow here: assumptions, the bias, some problems and flaws. We sort of tracked through that last time, and we want to hit on some of this again. Not so much curiosities, but I'll mention a few things that might be worth thinking about, but they're speculative. So as far as points of clarity, now this is the part where I'm essentially going to tell you what I feel really comfortable saying, and what I feel we have a high degree of certainty about. I think that the kingdom has been inaugurated in the first coming, the first advent, and these ideas right here are, in my view, painfully evident in the New Testament. I just don't see how you can miss them. Satan is, I use the word disbarred because I'm playing on the office of the Satan there, the accuser. I made the comment that he's essentially a prosecutor without a perp when it comes to Christians. It's just a pointless activity in terms of accusing Christians, laying some claim on them that they will die and go to the underworld where he is their owner. That just isn't the case anymore. The gods are disqualified from their jobs. They will be displaced. The gods of the nations. The nations, again, are sort of in default in terms of their ownership. They are being repossessed. The nations are being repossessed, if we can use that language. The kingdom is a global force identified with the church. The kingdom present, again, the king present as the Spirit who is Jesus, is but isn't Jesus, that sort of thing. So again, these are ideas I think that are pretty clear from the text. Now the consummation, the final, the apex of these things would be Satan is going to be eliminated and done away with. The gods are going to be dethroned and eliminated. The nations will be completely repossessed. The kingdom will be a global presence as a new Eden, and the king will be present incarnate. Again, these are my basic positions. So I believe in the kingdom already being here, but not yet in its fullness. I think the Lord will return. I think we will have the Lord on earth with his people in his global kingdom. And in my view, I merge that with the idea of a new heaven and new earth, i.e. the eternal state. So I appreciate I like the amillennialists over here, and I like the premillennialists over here, but I don't like the term millennium. Because I think it's just too restrictive. So we're going to focus on these things and see some divine counsel favoring here. So moving forward to the past, the new Eden. I hit this last year, so I will do this a bit quickly. I think that this might be a good way to frame it. We have the human family of believers who will join the divine family. I do not believe that we all get to become Yahwehs and then we get our own planets and, I'm not a Mormon. Let's just put it that way.
I don't get a bunch of wives in the future?
No, you don't get a bunch of wives or anything like that. So. But there is a sense that there is a New Testament doctrine of what scholars call theosis, becoming divine. Okay, we become like him, but we don't become him. Right? There's a difference there. And these passages talk about that. I like 1 John 3, behold what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called the children of God. And then John adds, and that is what we are. It's just sort of putting the emphasis on it there. And it talks about being like him. We'll be like him. We'll be as he is. We'll see him as he is and be like him. 2 Peter 2, again, we become partakers of the divine nature. Again, all this language in the New Testament. Romans 8, creation is awaiting in travail the arrival, the culmination, the unveiling of the sons of God, who are us. Ephesians 1, again, all this language pertains to that. And we have this, the one who overcomes and conquers. If somebody can go quickly to Revelation 2. Revelation 2. Look up verse 7 quickly.
He who is able to hear, let him listen to and give heed to what the Spirit says to the assemblies. To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the fruit of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God.
Right. Go ahead and read verse 11.
He who is able to hear, let him listen to and heed what the Spirit says to the assemblies, the churches. He who overcomes shall in no way be injured by the second death.
Right. Go ahead and read verse 17.
He who is able to hear, let him listen to and heed what the Spirit says to the assemblies. To him who overcomes, I will give to eat the manna that is hidden, and I will give him a white stone with a new name engraved on a stone, which no one knows or understands except he who receives it.
Right. Last one. We might as well do chapter 3, verse 5 and 12. There's some patterning going on here that I'll draw your attention to.
Thus says he who conquers, be clad in white garments, and I will not erase or blot out his name from the book of life. I will acknowledge him as mine, and I will confess his name openly before my Father and before his angels. And just 12.
Mm-hmm.
He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the sanctuary of my God. He shall never be put out of it or go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem which descends from my God out of heaven, and my own new name.
Okay, all of those, thank you, all of those are prefaced with the phrase, he who overcomes, the one who overcomes. And they all have something to do with membership, permanent membership in the family and the council, the presence of God. Because you get some temple imagery there, sort of equating us with pillars in the temple and that sort of thing. In the next slide, the next part of the discussion, the same phrase is going to be used of believers as well with respect to being put over the nations. So you actually have revelation, and again, they all occur in the section of Revelation that is speaking to the churches, i.e. believers. Okay? So the book of Revelation is starting to describe a restoration of the original Edenic intent. That to him that overcomes, believers will become, with God, part of the council, part of the bureaucratic ruling structure, and part of God's family. Again, it's using this language in this way, again, the overcoming language, to speak of permanent membership in these institutions. And the same thing is hinted at in these over here. Go ahead, Sharon. Flip to the
In
next
the
one.
midst of all that, there was Revelation 2:26. Is that on the next slide? Which
Here.
says, is it? Is it?
Yep.
Okay, I'll be fine.
Uh,
That was highlighted.
Okay. Again, expanding, again from this, we have this phrase, and the phrase is connected with our becoming part of the divine family, becoming, partaking of the divine nature, becoming a permanent fixture in the presence of God. That sort of idea. And to expand on that, again, we did this last year, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but in Ephesians 1, again, we get some of this repetition, and down here as well, where believers are referred to as hagioi. I really dislike the translation saints. I really wish it would be translated holy ones, because that's the way English translations tend to do it in the Old Testament. So if you don't translate it the same way both times, you lose the connection. It's easy to make the mental connection. If we're thinking of ourselves as holy ones here, it's easy to sort of go back to the Old Testament and see the same language. So again, these passages, and down here, these are the ones in the Corinthians that talked about us being the temple, being indwelt by the very presence of God. That's what makes us holy ones. We are in Christ, and Christ is in us through the Spirit, and all these familiar New Testament concepts. But they are matched and mixed and coupled with divine sonship and adoption language in the New Testament that is not accidental. God wants a family, so he uses family terms. He has a divine family, a non-human divine family, sons, of God, and so when that terminology is used in the New Testament, the non-human sons of God are also called holy ones. When both of those terms and all that language is used in the New Testament of believers, there's a deliberate conceptual connection being made that is inherently Edenic. Because again, if you think back to Eden, it was God on earth with both his heavenly beings, because where God is, the council is. They're inseparable. And he creates humankind to image him. The image is a plural because the other beings also are his imagers. They represent him in whatever realm they're supposed to do, whatever tasks they have. Human beings are the same. So right away, from the very beginning, you have this sense of there's this conceptual linkage between God's people and his council holy ones on earth with him. That gets disrupted, obviously, by the fall. And the rest of the story is trying to restore that. And when you get to the New Testament, you get the language again. You get the language repeated. And often in an eschatological sense. But even this, not all these passages here and back here, not all those passages are speaking of end times, of the final culmination. This is already but not yet as well. It's a reality that is, but its final form awaits. I think perhaps the best example of this is Hebrews 1 and 2, and I'll just summarize this. If you go to Hebrews 1 and 2 with a council setting in mind, I think it's one of the most powerful passages in the New Testament, because there is Jesus in the congregation, which is how the most translations put it. It's the same. It's one of the same words, that's used in the Septuagint for the council. Okay, there he is in the council, and what's he doing? He's presenting us to them and declaring us to be his brothers. I mean, it's so, pardon the expression, it's so pregnant with theology. It's an explosive passage that, people can appreciate it without a divine council context, but if you have that going in, it's just a reorienting thing as to what is going on in that scene. Because that's also the scene, well, which of the angels did God do this to? Which of the angels did God, and it's not about the angels, it's about us. And Jesus was the key, was the point person. And here he is in the council presenting us to God and his council as his brothers. And if we're his brothers, then we have shared ruling authority in that body, in that council with him and with the Father. There's just so much that's in there. I mean, you could spend a couple hours just going through that. Yes.
Is that why he had to become fully man?
Yes, I think there's a deliberate connection there. To he is the what's the word I'm looking for? He's the hinge point. He's the point person. He's the matrix, the intersection, whatever of both realms, both membership classes, both ruling class. I mean, everything converges in him, which is one of the points. I don't think when he's called the Alpha and the Omega, it refers just to like eternity. I think it's beginning and ending. I mean, he is both the beginning and the end, and he's also the convergence point,
The keystone.
the keystone. And, all these ideas, that convey the. Here's another one: centrality, of Christ. Go ahead.
Michael, in looking in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 9, it says, Thou hast loved righteousness and hated iniquity, therefore God, even thy God, hath anointed thee with the oil of gladness above thy fellows. I'm just trying to understand.
Mhm.
You have God, therefore God, even thy God, which is a distinction of maybe the invisible Yahweh, but there's something distinctly different about Jesus in that verse. And then who are his fellows? Because it sounds like he's being taken from among lesser beings, which he's not, and being lifted up. But it
Yeah,
wouldn't be
I have to
referring
actually
human.
look. I'd have to actually look at the whole.
Sure.
Can we hold
can
that
deal
till
with that
Q&A?
later. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, to make sure I'm in sync with you mentally, I'd have to look at that. Displacement, second theme. Earthly rule for human council members. Here you get the same language, him who overcomes. And in this case, if you look up these verses, we won't bother to do these. But if you look up these verses, it's about being set over the nations. It's about, you know what, I would like to look up 321 because I think that's the less familiar. If somebody can look up Revelation 321. I think that's even clearer than being set over the nations. Somebody has it, go ahead. Revelation 3:21.
Those who prove victorious, I will allow to share my throne, just as I was victorious myself and took my place with my Father on his throne.
I mean, that's really explicit. I mean, believers get to share the throne. I mean, just think about that. It's very similar, but even more explicit than Daniel 7, when the Son of Man passage. It doesn't just end with the unveiling of the Son of Man, because the Son of Man receives everlasting dominion and kingship and all this stuff. But then if you keep reading, even there, the kingship is shared with the holy ones and the people of the holy ones. You get both sides. You get both councils, as it were, two parts of the same council structure. But it's shared dominion And you have the same echo here. Here he's speaking specifically to believers. This is the one where we get set over the nations. Well, who are over the nations now? Who are the whose dominion are they? Well, it's the sons of God that are being displaced, or being replaced with the sons of God who are in Christ, which are us. So again, it's this shifting. And again, Psalm 82 has that judgment element in it, Daniel 7. 1 Corinthians 6 is one you're probably aware of. This is Paul needs to address the fact that Christians are going to, civil authorities against one another. They're taking each other to court, that sort of thing. And Paul says, why are you doing this? You should be taking care of this among yourselves. And then he says, sort of has this throwaway line. Don't you know that you will rule over angels?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you think of the council structure, God had sons of God, and then down here are the angels. Okay, this is us. We're the middle tier, the ones who inherit the nations, the rulership status. We are above, the angels. It's an oblique reference again to a hierarchical relationship, and one that we're inserted into by virtue of the comment. So it seems like sort of a throwaway statement, but again, it points to joint administration of things, and we have a position, of very real authority, again, in the new heaven and new earth and all that stuff. So, moving along, globalizing Eden. The day of the Lord. This is a link again. That one was for me. I'm not going to go to generate the search in my software. Basically, the phrase or closely related expressions occur over 200 times, or nearly 200 times in the prophets. And you have phrases like on that day, or in the latter days, something like that. And the day of the Lord has certain elements: judgment of the nations, judgment of God's people, but that isn't the eschatological view. What I mean here is this phrase will be used in various passages that are not speaking of end times. They're speaking of some other event, because the day of the Lord is a phrase that's associated with punishment of enemies or judgment. But when in the eschatological passages in the Old Testament, this element is not present. And why would that be? Well, because judgment for sin has already taken place. The cross, again, the intersection of these ideas. So we have judgment of the nations and future deliverance in the eschatological passages. Paul refers to the day of the Lord, and the context indicates he's thinking of the coming of Jesus in these passages. So, again, this isn't an evidence for or against any particular view of eschatology. I just want you to realize that in Paul's mind, the day of the Lord, the final day of the Lord, is connected with the return of Christ. Now, if you don't believe in a rapture, you think, well, that's easy. The Lord comes back and then we have Armageddon. Well, those two things happen in conjunction with each other. That's right. But, if you take the pre-trib position, this doesn't really contradict it either. It's just an easier fit in the one. 2 Timothy 1:12 uses the term that day to designate a future time when Christians will be rewarded. So I picked these two because they show both elements. There's judgment and there's reward. Again, it follows the typical pattern you would expect with Day of the Lord. Now, another part of the Day of the Lord is the eschatologization of chaos imagery. In other words, the use of chaos imagery in association with end times. And probably the best passage for that is Isaiah 27:1. In that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the twisting serpent, Leviathan, the crooked serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. Leviathan's final destruction will thus coincide with the eschatological restoration of Israel. If you read after verse 1, verses 2 and following, this is what you read about: the restoration of Israel. Now the question for us is, does that mean national Israel? Or does that mean, the church? Well, if the day of the Lord is in conjunction with the return of Christ, it's probably best to take this as this is just me talking, it's probably best to take that as referring to the establishment, the consummation of the kingdom. And that is circumcision neutral. That's global. It's not just the church. It's not national Israel. It's everything. So again, I don't think you can use this for or against any particular view. But what I really want to highlight is this language again. This verse shows that Leviathan, chaos, was not dead in Genesis. He's dead here. Can't be dead if the Lord needs to, slay him here. Okay. And again, it's not an actual creature or critter. The idea is that in Genesis, even when God says it's very good, there's still that untamed thing going on. There's still that untamed element. In the future, that's gone. That's dealt with. Which is why, we get these in the Old Testament, we get a foreshadowing of what the kingdom is going to be like. And of course, these things right here, sick and disabled, we could add resurrection to that. This is the kind of stuff Jesus is doing when he's around the first time. He wants you to know what the kingdom of God is here, and this is what it's going to be like. But of course, he knows that this is just the inauguration. This is the kickstart. But it's messaging as far as this is what kingdom life is like. There's full health. There's no death. All this language, again, these are all passages in the prophets that the land will be supernaturally abundant. It's Eden. Okay, of course it'll be supernaturally abundant. That's what Eden was like. Peace throughout all creation, no conflict. And again, all nations will know that Yahweh is God. Again, the nations are repossessed. So again, the familiar themes. So in Revelation 21:1, it should be no surprise that when we get to the end of Revelation, we see that the sea was no more. And of course it's no more, because now creation is perfected. And we have the tree of life, again, Edenic imagery here. Zechariah 14 describes the dark side. I'll make that a separate topic. The final battle that precedes this. So the negative side, or not the negative, I look at it as a positive because evil gets what's coming to it. But the violent side is probably a better way to say it. The violent side of the day of the Lord concerns this final battle. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time here because I'm going to lead to something that I did not share last year that I think is kind of cool in terms of an Armageddon Divine Council link. Zechariah 14 is a famous passage that anybody who studies prophecy has run into this one. I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. The city shall be taken, houses plundered, women raped, and all this kind of stuff. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on the day of battle. On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives, and we just read that passage. So this is, again, a future, an eschatological conflict and battle that's described here. Zechariah 12, we have the siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. On that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who lift it will surely hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it. Start seeing familiar patterns. Jerusalem under siege, the nations gathered against it. Okay, then the Lord intervenes, protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the nations that gather against Jerusalem are punished. Anybody who does eschatology is going to look at Zechariah 14, Zechariah 12 as describing, Armageddon, some sort of final conflict, final battle. And same thing for Joel 3. Let the nations stir themselves up and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is in this passage not really defined. In fact, in no passage is it explicitly defined what this valley is. There I will sit to judge all the nations. Put in this sickle, the harvest is ripe. Okay. We get this language in Revelation, obviously. Sources like Josephus and contemporary geographers tell us that the Jehoshaphat Valley was the Kidron Valley just east of Jerusalem. Now, I'm telling you this for a reason. Because we have some issues to think about. if we take all those passages together of a final battle at the day of Yahweh, we need to sort of consider them in light of Armageddon in Revelation 16. Is it going to be a coherent picture? And the above alignment illustrates that Revelation cannot be understood in linear chronological terms. Okay, that part isn't clear to you, but I'm going to show you something that at least Revelation, at least in part, listen to my wording. I'm not endorsing that all of it is repeated cycles, but there are some places where it's pretty hard to deny that's going on. And I'm going to show you 2 or 3 places in particular. And I'm going to compare these Old Testament passages we just looked at from Zechariah and Joel, and we're going to look at Revelation 16 with Armageddon, and you're going to see that there's some cycling going on. And we'll talk about the term too. Revelation 16. Behold, I'm coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, so on and so forth. Familiar language. And they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew, it's important, that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, a loud voice comes out, and we have an earthquake and great hailstones in association with this Armageddon event. Revelation 19, we have armies of heaven arrayed in fine linen, white horses. The one sitting on a white horse comes back. Again, everybody says this is the second coming. I would certainly agree. So here's the battle. Here's the intervention right here, the Lord's return. And after the Lord's return, we get this. He called, I saw an angel standing in the sun, a loud voice. He called to the birds that fly directly overhead. Come, gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings and captains and mighty men, and the flesh of horses and their riders. Now, the things that I have in blue here, earthquake, hailstones, calling to the birds come and eat the corpses and all that stuff. Those are 3 things I want to zero in on. Well, here we have them listed. This is again another search that I'm not going to bother to link out to. Let's see here. These 3 things are present in these 3 references. Does anybody know what these references are? What happens in Ezekiel 38 and 39?
The destruction of Jerusalem.
Be more specific.
It's like Gog and Magog.
It's Gog and Magog. Now, this I will come down on. These 3 elements that I just showed you, they're all associated with the Armageddon passage. Jesus comes on the white horse to end that battle. Okay? There's no way. Okay, if these 3 elements just so happen to be in here, drawn from here, and there's more to it than this, but I'm stopping here for a reason. How in the world can you have Gog and Magog occur before the second coming, anywhere? A lot of your pre-trib systems have that. And there's a reason that they have it that will become apparent soon. Because they really want to have this be a separate event from Armageddon. Because not doing so sort of mars certain points of the chronological system. I'll leave it at that. But know this observation. By the way, the birds eating the flesh is really rare. Okay, that's really not a common phrase. And so it's really sort of a telltale sign that we're creating a link between this and Revelation where this occurs, and it does not occur prior to a rapture or something like that. It just doesn't. And even if you take a rapture and a 7-year tribulation, I know some systems that have Gog and Magog occurring before the rapture. I can't conceive of how you get there. That's independent of the rapture issue. I'm coming down on that one because this is one of the passages I think there's most incoherence about in most prophetic systems, most prophetic schemes. And it used to be because Gog and Magog were somehow equated with Russia, okay, Prince of Rosh, which is actually a mistranslation. It's chief prince. Rosh is not Russia. Hebrew is not Russian. Just like English isn't Chinese. Just because I make certain sounds with my mouth in English doesn't mean the same set of sounds in Chinese mean the same things. You laugh, but that's where people are at. That's where they're at. And that is just utterly bogus. I mean, I don't know any other way to characterize that. Now, what that means is that this event, if it's tied to this, is connected in some way to Jerusalem, because all those other passages we just read, we had the final conflict at Jerusalem. And again, we have a reference here and in Ezekiel 5:5 that refers metaphorically to the holy city, the city of Zion and things like that. So here's the question. If we have these Armageddon descriptions, and we have this connection over here, and we have this connection to Jerusalem in here and in all those other passages, shouldn't Armageddon happen at Jerusalem? You would think, where do people usually put Armageddon?
Megiddo?
Megiddo. Why would Revelation 16:16 point to Megiddo when all the rest of the final battle passages point to Jerusalem? I would say it doesn't. Okay? Revelation 16:16 is not about Megiddo. Armageddon is not about Megiddo. That association is made because of the similar sound, the similar terminology, or the parts of terms. The term Armageddon is actually a conflation, that is a combination of the earlier Jerusalem passages with this particular passage, Zechariah 12:10. Let's take a look at the term, because this is going to produce something that I think is really cool. Revelation 16:16, here they are. John says, they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Now, if you look at the Greek, remember yesterday I said this little mark here is the rough breathing mark. It's the sound. So in Greek, you would say this Har-Mageddon. Har-Mageddon. In Hebrew, Har means mountain. There are no mountains in Megiddo. Megiddo is everywhere else in the Old Testament described as a plain. If you've ever been there, you know that. It's just a wide, flat expanse. There is no mountain of Megiddo.
Doesn't it sit at the base of the mount where I can't remember Carmel? The base of Mount Carmel.
Carmel is to the northwest. One tip of what would be the wider valley of Megiddo gets close to Carmel. And see, you bring that up because that is the typical way that you get a mountain of Megiddo. That's cheating. Because people somehow desperately want this at Megiddo. And I say desperately, that's a little bit of an overstatement. They feel compelled because they don't know better. So that there's not a contradiction in the Bible, they have to have some justification for Megiddo being the location.
Is it a staging point?
No. I would say not only do the other passages point to Jerusalem, but again, Megiddo is not a mountain and has no mountain. I don't think the point is Megiddo at all. Again, here's references to the plain of Megiddo. Here's what I think is going on with the term. What John does many times is he'll we had this yesterday when I had a little chart on Revelation about how John will take different parts of passages, typically in Daniel, and then he'll combine them, in one image. We saw it like with the beast. The beast in Revelation 13 actually has elements of the beast in both Daniel 2 and 7, and John merges them all together and makes a nice little ball of it. John does that elsewhere with prophetic passages in other places, and this is one of them. Zechariah 12:11 is unique in that it's the only time Megiddo is spelled with an N at the end. It's Megiddon. And so the end element becomes important. It's an archaic, odd spelling. It means that Jerusalem is elsewhere in Zechariah. He's talking about Jerusalem. Why don't we go back to Zechariah 12? I'll show you what I mean here. I think I have it here. There we go. Oh, I cut it off at 10. Yeah, somebody go to Zechariah 12.
Verse 11.
Of course, I may have it here too. Oh, here I have it. Sorry about that. I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over his firstborn. On that day, the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning for Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. This refers to a different event back in the Old Testament. Actually, Hadad Rimmon was a place notorious for child sacrifice, and so as great as the mourning was there, it'll be when all this happens in Jerusalem. People are going to be just as sad, just as bitterly sad as people were when this sort of stuff happened in the plain of Megiddo in ancient times. I'm using the English translation here. What happens here is that Jerusalem is the point. Zechariah is being consistent with all the other passages. When the Lord comes back and they look on him whom they've pierced, he comes to Jerusalem. This is where he stops the battle. But what John does is John knows this, and he's going to cryptically both hide and tell you something about the event. He's going to take the last two letters of Megiddo, the D and the N, and he's going to add them to the word har. Okay? And then we have to deal with the middle consonant. The other component of Megiddon, most assume that in Hebrew, these Greek letters are the Hebrew MGD, and so we get Megiddo. There's another option. This little squiggly here is also a Hebrew consonant that gets transliterated in Greek with a G, with a G. In Hebrew, you'd pronounce it with like in the back of your throat. Best illustration is Gomorrah is actually spelled Gomorrah, not with the Hebrew G. But we don't have this. We have that. Okay. Greek didn't have this, but Greek had a G. So Greek actually uses a G for two different Hebrew letters. It's assumed when you get Mageddon, oh, it must be the G. I'm going to suggest that it's this one because this word is really important in divine council stuff. Har-Mageddon is actually Har Moed, and the O-N is taken from the Zechariah 12 reference to link that with Jerusalem. What does Har-Mageddon mean? There's the literal translation.
Wow.
Mount of Assembly.
Wow.
And it comes from Isaiah 14, the Lucifer passage. How are you fallen from heaven? Halal ben Shakar. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly. I will sit on the Har Moed. The Har Moed. This is the place where the divine council meets. I am going to rule the council. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. Will make myself like the Most High. Far reaches of the north is Hebrew Yarkate Tzafon. We've talked about Tzafon before, both the geographical and the cosmic north. So I want to talk about these two phrases, Har Moed. Har Moed tells you that the Battle of Armageddon is going to take place at and for Jerusalem, because that is where God lives. That is where the council is. That is the Mount of Assembly. And we have here the other phrase, the heights of the north, gets used in Psalm 48. Now, think about what you're reading, because it's not going to make any literal sense. Great is the Lord, greatly to be praised in the city of our God, his holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth, Mount Zion in the heights of the north, in the far north, in the Yarkate Tzafon, the city of the great king. Is Jerusalem located in the north? Not even close. The language is cosmic. It has nothing to do with literal geography. Mount Zion was perceived as the cosmic dwelling place, meeting place, headquarters of God and his council. And so when John's telling you that the enemies are going to be gathered at a place called Har Mageddon, he's talking about Jerusalem. But you only know that if you know what the Har Moed is. So it's a cryptic reference to all the passages agree. It's not that like 20 of them say the battle's at Jerusalem and then you get to Revelation and it changes to Megiddo. It doesn't. They're all in agreement. This is a battle for the holy city, for Mount Zion. That's what Armageddon is. Both in terms of, people, human conflict, warfare, and, you get a sense that this is a war between gods and men. I mean, this is like for all the marbles in both the earthly plane and the non-earthly plane. There's that much significance attached to this event. This is the final battle. So implications would be, you go back, we have these elements here, they match in Ezekiel, we have them here in the New Testament. And guess where else you have them? You have a reference to Gog and Magog in Revelation 20. You know why this is weird? Because it's after the 1,000 years. Well, no, wait a minute. I thought Armageddon is before the 1,000 years. It is. This is usually this correlation, Gog and Magog, because Gog and Magog stuff happened 3 chapters earlier, and here it's happening after. This is taken by most scholars as showing that Revelation cannot here be read chronologically. It's this repetitive idea. But I know people who hold so tenaciously to the 1,000-year idea. And again, I don't deny an earthly kingdom. I think you know that by now. But they hold so tenaciously to a linear reading of Revelation and a 1,000-year kingdom, strictly 1,000 years, that they just literally arbitrarily say this must be a different Gog and Magog other than the one in the Old Testament. That is really forced. That is a cart before the horse approach. That's saying, I want my system so badly, I'm just going to say it can't mean what it meant in it can't refer to what it is in the Old Testament. It has to be something entirely new to save the system. I actually had a student email me one time about this and ask me if there was a disagreement in manuscripts. Is there something wrong with the text here? And my answer was no. Instead of asking yourself, is there something wrong with the New Testament, you ought to be asking yourself, is there something wrong with my system? Okay, but a lot of people don't. Again, language repeated before and after. And so the only way to really get that is this idea, at least here. So I've put these in red because this is where those terms show up right here, and they show up here again, and they show up here again. So it's a cyclical thing, at least with respect to this much stuff. Foe from the north. Let's stop there and get the question.
He says battle takes place in Jerusalem, probably Temple Mount.
Mm-hmm.
But Moses was given the plan for the temple, and see thou make it according to the plan I showed you in the mount. A heavenly temple, an earthly temple, the new Jerusalem coming down, an earthly Jerusalem, a heavenly Jerusalem. So that this is going to be on earth. Okay?
It's on earth, but it has ramifications for both control of the unseen world and domination of the earth. It's the heavyweight title match. Okay, who gets to be called king, and who is the king? Who rules the earth and the unseen realms, and who doesn't? It is in every sense the final battle, the final conflict.
And these beings have been here, I think, and they're coming back.
Yeah, and so are God's, because Zechariah 14 talks about the Lord bringing his holy ones with him to this battle. This is why at Qumran, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a famous Dead Sea Scroll called, appropriately enough, the War Scroll. And it spells out the writers, living in the 2nd or 1st century BC, their conception of the final battle. And they literally have a war, literally, between gods and men, where they're like both on planet duking it out over Jerusalem. That's the prize. So it was very much, in their consciousness. And there are other passages that associate the divine council and a call for war for Jerusalem.
How would they come up with these concepts?
I think what they're trying to communicate is that there's a seen world and an unseen world. They're both real, and they are both at stake. And this is the best way to do it. But what other language would you use? I couldn't conceive of another way to describe conflict for a people. We have different metaphors for different things based upon our modern conception. We could call things a contagion or a cancer or something. That's not going to work with them because they don't know what those things are. They do know what battles are. They do know what warfare is. They know what killing and life and death are. They know those things. And so warfare imagery, like we talked about a couple days ago, putting your foot on the neck of the enemy and the dogs lapping up the blood, because they'd seen those things. That's the language of experience, of appearance. And so it's going to get used with respect to both realms, because that is what communicates the idea. To use something that's foreign, it's not going to occur to the author anyway. You're not going to be able. Think about it. I'm going to sit down and write a letter using unfamiliar metaphors to both me and that's just incoherent. You're going to use what you know and what the recipient knows. Another thing, in the Old Testament, there's what scholars call a recurring theme or motif. And I've mentioned this before, that everything bad just seems to come from the north. And there was a reason why militarily this happened, because of the Fertile Crescent and all that stuff. And it sort of created this twitchy psychology that, if trouble's going to come, it's just going to come from up there, because it sort of always does, that kind of thing. And we saw that the north, there's both literal geography, and then there's this cosmic north as well. Revelation will also often portray the final enemy as Babylon. And that makes sense to the ancient reader because Babylon took them into exile, and Babylon came from the north. So when you get to Ezekiel, Gog and Magog, guess where they come from? The far portions of the north. Where does Antiochus come from? The north, because that's where, the Seleucid Empire was located. Again, this idea gets repeated over and over and over. And we talked about Bashan and, again, the cosmic north. So, again, here you have, of course, the map, and you've got Babylon over here, but they have to travel. To get down here, you have to descend from the north. Now, this works itself out in some unusual ways. And here you have descriptions of Babylon as being northern, and even though we know that it's not, and it's because of the travel route. Gog and Magog, again, from the north. There they are up there, so that's normal, that's natural. But this gets abstracted in a way that some Jews and early Christians, the way they conceived of Antichrist. This tradition led some to suspect that the great eschatological enemy, if you're a Jew, you're not going to use the word Antichrist. You're going to be thinking the enemy we have to face at the day of the Lord is going to come from the north. So they associated this with Bashan and Dan, because this was, again, the center of apostasy. And the reason they did that are certain passages like this. I just want to show you where this Dan Antichrist psychology comes from and how it gets argued. I think it's interesting. I'm not committed to it, but I do think there's something worth thinking about here. I would say I haven't adopted this yet, but I'm still thinking about it. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backward. This is Jacob's blessing of his children, and then we get something that doesn't quite sound like a blessing. And it associates Dan, again, with serpentine language. Deuteronomy 30-22, of Dan he said, Dan is a lion's cub that leaps from Bashan. Bashan is a loaded term. And the association in some sense is natural because Dan is like at Bashan, geographically. So you could restrict it to geography, or you could ask yourself, well, should we attach some cosmic sinister meaning to this, and then, of course, to Dan? Now, the really odd thing that a lot of early Christian writers noticed is Revelation 7. You know where this is going. The 144,000, go ahead and turn to Revelation 7. I don't think I printed it out. You have your Bible, flip over to Revelation 7. And the part that we all know is there's 144,000, and the text says 12,000 from each tribe. Okay, go ahead and look at the passage. Just read through it, 8 verses. Tell me if you notice something. Leave it to Irenaeus to notice something like this. What do you notice? Dan is not listed. There are still 12 tribes, but Dan is not one of them. That means nobody, or does it? I shouldn't say that means. Does that mean that Dan is not a believing tribe? Dan is not elect? There are no believers from Dan. In other words, does that create a really creepy, sinister feeling about Dan? For some early Christians, it did. Because they noticed that, and then they went back to these Old Testament passages, and it's like Bashan, serpent. What happened to Dan in Revelation 7? Like, why is Dan excluded? Now, we don't get a listing of the tribes for the gates of the new city, the New Jerusalem. So we can't explicitly say that Dan is excluded there. But if you take the reference to the 12 tribes there as the same 12 tribes here, Dan is also not part of the holy city. It's just kind of weird. Now, if you take this northern model at face value, and we could throw in Dan here if you want. Again, I'm just showing you that this is there. You could put down here tribe of Dan. Okay. But the problem is though that Antiochus was a Gentile. I'll say this. There are some, and again, I don't say this because I think it creates a difficulty. It's not an insurmountable difficulty for inerrancy, but it creates a difficulty. Some scholars believe that Dan was not an original tribe. And that's because there are certain things about Danite. First of all, the Danites give up their inheritance and they migrate north. There are also certain issues with place names associated with Danite places and cities that are not Semitic. In and of itself, that doesn't mean much because lots of people, lived in Canaan. But some people wonder if the Danites are not related to and perhaps the same as the Danunians, who were one of the sea peoples, of which the Philistines were one. And then if you do that, then you got the association of the Philistines with guess who? The Rephaim. And so some people think that that's another strand, another reason to exclude Dan. That there's just something wrong with Dan. They're a bad presence that is essentially an infiltration. It's also the Danites that are mixed up in the last 3 chapters of Judges, which are pretty horrific. There are other reasons for that, though. Again, I'm not coming down here anywhere. This I would put under the area of speculation. I'm just telling you this gets discussed in the literature. Back to the Antiochus model, this gets discussed too, and it's probably more familiar and digestible. Antiochus does or is these things. So there are some that would say Antiochus is sort of the poster boy, the template for characteristics of the Antichrist. The one that throws a lot of people is he was a Gentile, because there are a lot of people out there, the Antichrist must be a Jew because he needs to be like a flipped version of Jesus. Well,
We have 4 minutes till 12:30.
okay. You can just be a pseudo Messiah as well. It doesn't really attach any ethnicity to it. Antichrist and Nephilim, Rephaim. I'm actually going to stop here. If we want to do this in Q&A, we can. Because, again, this is another one of those things I'll file under. I just want to show you this because it gets discussed. And that is the gematria of 666.
We will do that.
Okay, so let's stop here. It's a good place to stop then. And we can come back and hit that. That won't take too long.
Is gematria